Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the AFS Cinema and Jewels in the Wasteland. We have an exciting month this month. You saw we're doing the UCLA Festival of Preservation, which is happening every weekend. Brand new restored 35mm prints from the UCLA Film and Television Archive. We have our Patricia Highsmith series starting this week, actually, with Strangers on a Train. And we have our final few films of Jewels in the Wasteland with The Dead next week and with Wings of Desire following that. So don't miss it and don't be a stranger. So tonight we've got Oliver Stone, we've got 1989, we have Tom Cruise, and we have our artistic director Richard Linklater here to talk to us about Born on the 4th of July. And he will be here afterwards with me talking about the movie, so if you like the movie, or if you just want to talk about it with us, we're going to be here afterwards, so stay in your seats after the credits roll for the discussion. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, guys. All right. I wanted to include this movie for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is I think you couldn't represent the 80s cinema without talking about Oliver Stone and Tom Cruise. They hadn't really been represented. I guess, was Cruise in any of those? No, he wasn't in Rumblefish. He was in The Outsiders. I was thinking some of his earlier 80s films. But, you know, they both start off the decade pretty much in obscurity, end up where they are. You know, one of the biggest stars. I think Cruise was the biggest box office star, and Stone, by this point, is the most, I would say, you know, acclaimed, successful, like auteur. You know, he had a good second half of the 80s. He started off, you know, he came a little bit later. He had a frustrating start. He was a writer. You know, he'd written Midnight Express, and then he'd written Scarface and a bunch of other things. But he had directed a couple horror films, Seizure and The Hand, like in '81. And I think that was the playbook from the generation just a little bit older than him, the Scorsese's and Bogdanovich's and Coppola's. You know, they'd have to go make that exploitation film for Corman, and then you break into the industry. But he kind of was a little bit after them, but he sort of did that. And I don't know if there was any big strategy, but those films aren't really, you know, him in that way. He kind of caught his voice, got the, I guess, just as a writer, he had won an Oscar for Midnight Express, and you know, he got the clout to finally get his film made, and that was Salvador in '86. So he was on this tremendous run. Once he was in the director's chair, he wasn't getting out of it. He was making a film a year, and he was on just an incredible run. It was Salvador, Platoon, Wall Street, Talk Radio, and now Born on the 4th of July. Tom Cruise, obviously, you know, he had smaller parts in some things, some more movies, Taps and stuff, and then, you know, here comes Risky Business and All the Right Moves, and I think most, you know, I love him in Color of Money. I almost showed Color of Money in this series. I just love that movie. But, you know, Top Gun is obviously, you know, a huge, that made him the biggest star in the world. But I've been giving Cruise shit this whole series. Just kind of as I talk about how shitty the 80s were, there was always a smiling Tom Cruise kind of, you know, with his shades on, future so bright, I gotta wear shades kind of vibe. And, but this movie to me redeems Tom Cruise for the whole decade. Not that he needs redeeming, but it's just such a brave, all-in performance by him. And I think it's wonderful. Stone, he's just perfectly cast because he's got all that gung-ho belief, you know. You know, the movie, it starts, well, you know, the real theme for tonight is war movies. And I want to talk after about war movies and the notion of war movies. That's been on my mind for over 10 years. You know, Das Boot you know, the early part of this series a couple years ago, really just talked about what is you know, movies and war just go hand in hand so well, but can you really make an anti-war movie? Everyone claims to be making an anti-war movie, but they really aren't. Nobody is. But I really want to watch this movie closely because I think this is about as good an anti-war movie as ever been made. That was my opinion at the time because it's so damn real, you know, like he had done Platoon, and Stone's the real deal. You know, he fought. I'm not so sure, maybe we can talk about this after. I'm not sure if he's the first Vietnam vet, you know, a guy who had been shot, who had, you know, gone through Vietnam, who was now making movies about Vietnam. but his films have a certain authenticity. You know, I can't take anything away from Platoon. I mean, it's great, but it is kind of mythic. It's big. This film I find much more complicated, and it's really so much more about what happens when you come home, the disillusionment of the vet, the way our country, and I'm sure every country, you know, they build up the killer with all the notions of heroicism and glory and honor, and you know, you see young Ron Kovic, Tom Cruise's character, he out in Long Island, going to the 4th of July parades, buying in, he enlists, boom, he's in the battlefield, and then, you know, he's critically wounded. I mean, things are just fucked up. It's a terrible war. It's not what he thought. It's just the horrors of war. Comes back a paraplegic, and then the real horror kind of begins then, another kind of horror, the way that your country just kind of discards you. There's some horrific scenes, really true to life, real to him and to this day, unfortunately, where he's just kind of, you're at the VA hospital, no one's, you know, you're about to lose your leg because you're not getting the right treatment, they're understaffed, underfunded. It's just how the country just discards the vet so easily, you know, and that's kind of the birth of his radicalism. Ron Kovic is the man here. He was just an amazing peace activist. He spoke at conventions. He was just the great trajectory of gung-ho soldier, all in on, you know, what's so great about our country, to being just an absolute pacifist, anti-war activist, and very vocal. And he wrote this book, Born on the 4th of July, in '76. And I think Oliver Stone had wanted to make this movie for a long time. I might be wrong, but I think he wanted to make it before Platoon even. But it just, I think Platoon came first for whatever reasons. But you know, he eventually got to it. And I just think it's a triumph. You know, Stone makes his points. People give him shit. I'm an unabashed Oliver Stone fan, I'll just say right now. I just think he's such a dynamic filmmaker. He has a lot to say, you know, and he says it. But there's a certain kind of guts and honesty, and he's just, some people accuse him of being too blunt. He's hitting you over the head with a baseball bat. But he's a little too good a filmmaker for that, I think. So I just think Tom Cruise is great in this, and it's just, it gets away from the mythic that war movies, particularly I would say by filmmakers who weren't at war themselves, you can't help it. You just fall into this beautiful myth making about war and all that shit. So it's such an unvarnished picture. But the 80s was an interesting time because we were safely out of Vietnam. That was '75. But by the early 80s, you saw we were sort of relitigating the war, refighting the war. You saw that in First Blood and the Rambo movies. I think it took years for the U.S. to realize, oh, we kind of lost that war. You know, when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, it was always like, we've never lost a war. And it's like, and then it was like, oh, I think we tied that one. And it was pretty soon, I think we kind of lost that one. And as that dawned on the culture, I think you started to see it in the war. There were just a lot of Vietnam movies that, you know, were made in the 80s. And there was an interesting dialogue between them. Some were like, we're winning the war, and then there was a lot more like the horrors of war, more cautionary. But here, I wrote down a bunch right off, and you've seen, I think you've probably seen most of them, but there were just a lot. These are just the Vietnam films of this era. You know, Full Metal, and this isn't all of them even. Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, Good Morning Vietnam, Casualties of War, Hamburger Hill, Gardens of Stone, Dogs of War, Streamers, Killing Fields, like I said, the Rambo movies, First Blood and all those. Bunch of Chuck Norris movies, Missing in Action. Uncommon Valor, 84C Charlie Mopek. It's an interesting movie. So there's a lot of Vietnam movies. And then, of course, there's always a lot of World War II movies. That never goes away. You can't go wrong there. And worldwide, too. We showed Das Boot earlier, a great German version of the war. Glory, British film. Empire of the Sun, The Big Red One. Come and See. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Come and See is probably the most gruesome war movie, most real. It's a Russian film from the mid-'80s that's just amazing. But it's the grimmest war movie you'll probably ever see. And then even Clint Eastwood got in on the action and made Heartbreak Ridge, which pretty great movie. You know, it's a good Clint movie about, ends up being about Grenada? It was the Grenada invasion, or whatever we did there. We rescued some students or something. It's so not heroic. But that was, Reagan, the 80s were edgy, man. It was like, there wasn't a real war going on, but there were all these little skirmishes. Reagan was always sending in little troops to do something, and on top of it, the Cold War was really peaking, and you didn't trust Reagan. He seemed like he was a little out of it, like kind of the way we feel right now about our president. It kind of felt maybe 70% of that under Reagan. Just, you know, he would say glib things about dropping bombs. It felt like it was kind of apocalyptic, and the Cold War was full blown. So there was this unease, and then there was just a lot of saber rattling about Central America. And even when Oliver Stone, I think the Vietnam movies were interpreted largely as cautionary tales to keep us out of war down in like Salvador and Nicaragua and, you know, places like that. And Stone's movie, Salvador, is really about that. A journalist, that's a great movie, his first kind of Oliver Stone movie. And it deals with the two American journalists, photojournalists and a writer, end up down there just kind of looking for action and find out things are so much worse. So it's one of those eye-opening, oh shit, you know, this is a real horrible local, you know, war going on, and they're covering it. But so just the notions of heroicism and war, that's what I think about when I see this movie, and it's just, like I said, such an honest depiction of the disillusionment of that and kind of the building of a true anti-war pacifist, outspoken, you know, the radicalism. So I think that second part, it's about the second half of the movie, I guess. It tells a very thorough story, but I think it's just, you know, it was good material it was a great marriage between Ron Kovic's actual life and Stone's sensibility and experience over there. It's pretty a rock and roll moment for everyone involved. And then, of course, Cruise and a wonderful supporting cast too. So I'm really curious to see this again because, yeah, I think after we should talk about that. You know, what is a war movie, and you know, can you make an anti-war movie? So I really do think this is a good attempt. So, all right, well, let's enjoy this, and we'll be around after to chat about it. So thanks. How many of you guys are seeing this for the first time? Quite a few. Well, we are very privileged to watch it. A beautiful 35mm print. Yeah, it's really awesome.
When you're in Hollywood, visit Universal Studios.
Yeah, you gotta go.
So, what, Rick, makes an anti-war movie?
Oh, wow.
After watching this again.
What do you guys think? Is this an anti-war movie? You know, there's what I appreciate about it. I, you know, hadn't seen it in a while, but I was thinking like, you know, there's not one heroic thing that happens till the very end. I remember watching it at the time, and I knew we were in for a treat when in the wrestling match Tom Cruise loses. You know, I was like, oh wow, I've never seen Tom Cruise lose at anything. You know, he's the best at everything. I was like, You know, and I appreciated back then. I said, you know, Tom Cruise is all in on this. You know, he's so, well, certainly, as I said in the intro, so different than his Top Gun, you know, character. But it's pretty, the heroicism is his performance, and I think in the end, you know, when he's speaking out. To me, that's the heroic, you know, narrative. But, you know, he doesn't get the prom date. They kill women and children, you know, they kill civilians, he accidentally kills one of his own, everything's he's just a regular guy, confused and, you know, suffering the tragedy of everyone, you know, so it's amazing I guess his faith in Oliver Stone was so complete in the material, maybe he got to know, I'm sure he, you know, got to know Ron Kovic and stuff, but it's pretty bold undertaking for Mr. Cruise, I think. Yeah.
The lapses in the film are so interesting, the way he's using time and jumping around, and
he's telling a big story. It's covering a lot of ground, a a lot of years.
But the war itself is so short.
Yeah, thankfully. I think by this point, I think if you're going to make a war movie, especially a Vietnam War movie, it's kind of, it's been done. In fact, Stone did it himself 3 years earlier. And I think he saw, no, this is a coming home movie. This is the aftermath. This is something else entirely. So it's a war movie, but it's kind of, it's just briefly a war movie. It's really the effects and the before and after, really. So I think that's the approach. But it's still a, at the time, I remember when this came out, it was an interesting fall. This came out later in '89, almost one of the last films of the '80s, actually. But, the wall had just come down, the Cold War was kind of ending. It wasn't like one day it was over, but the Berlin Wall came down, Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, that whole Cold War, that had just ended. And so this was this was a period film. It didn't feel really relevant to that moment. And that's why I think this film is so kind of timeless. It's a period film from '89 back to '50s, '60s, '70s. But it seems to have aged really well, in my opinion, just because it was a period film then, But it didn't really have much to do. There was a certain optimism in the air at that moment this came out. It was like, hey, didn't we just kind of bloodlessly and conflict-free, ultimately, the Cold War ended with a whimper. It wasn't a battle. It was just kind of a disillusion. So this was a throwback. It felt kind of out of place in a certain way. At the time, it wasn't an urgent message right then. At that very second, we were still a couple years away from our next, war. I would say Desert Storm was the next official U.S. I mean, there's always little things, but the next official U.S. troops are going into, Iraq. That was a couple years away. So, but still, it's a timeless tale. And, I actually watched, I just YouTubed, thinking about this film in the last week, Oliver Stone. He won Best Director for Platoon and this, actually. But I saw his acceptance speech for Platoon, and he says, I think you're honoring me to say that something like Vietnam should never happen again. That he just comes right out and says, and if anything like that happens again in our lifetime, everyone who died in Vietnam will have died in vain because we will have learned nothing. And he's just said it. And then he started thanking people. But that was his first thing. It was like, oh, Stone, he's not messing around. He, like I said, he makes his points. I think he's a great great storyteller. He's not a subtle storyteller. But it's his personality. He pulls it off. It works beautifully, I think.
Well, it's so cinematic, and it's such a beautiful production in a way
Yes,
that, if you're going to make a handsome production,
It's
go
rich.
for it.
Yeah.
and make it great, and he does. But
But he'll do the flashback, like at the very end. I guess he's not counting us to remember 2 hours earlier that the mom said, I had a vision that you had a dream that you were saying things, like, just in case we forgot or missed that. So it's a choice, but it's a good choice. You just buy in. He makes those points, very clearly. But I guess it's all, legit. It's all true, or most of it, I think.
the other interesting thing to talk about when we talk about war movies is our relationship as an audience to violence and to war movies, and that we buy in. And I'm wondering when this came out, because people, Top Gun was an incredibly popular film, and were people coming to this with this incredibly dark material with an idea that it was gonna be a fun war movie? I mean, I think Born on the 4th of July had some familiarity, but still.
Yeah, even the title, which Ron Kovac actually was born on the 4th of July, but just the Yankee Doodle Dandy, that whole notion. But Top Gun's not really a war movie. It's a Cold War movie. They're just like training. There's a little. It's not like there's not a war. It's just. But this was such for me in my mind at that time, because I really resented. I was kind of the generation just young enough. We missed Vietnam by a good shot, but like none of the people in my generation really wanted to be in the military. It was an ugly thing, you know, post-Vietnam, but you could see it. You could see how our culture, you know, we live in such a war machine culture. We spend all our tax money for this huge military. You could just almost see it rev back up. And, you know, Hollywood's right in there with them. You know, that's what got me thinking so much about war movies. Like Truffaut said, you know, you can't really make an anti-war movie because you're just by showing it. You know, cinema's powerful. You're showing this. And I think people just go, well, you know, it's tough, but man, they are, you know, there's so much myth and crap around our fictional depictions of it that it's such a, almost every war movie ends up a recruiting tool. I think the one, I guess the one issue, the one thing I would always think, does this make someone want to go to war? Does a movie like Full Metal Jacket, you know, it shows war is ridiculous, but, you know, I think it ultimately, so many, you know, Private Ryan, almost every war movie we can think of, I think ultimately begets the next war, you know, as long as people, and especially now that we're in a all-volunteer army, I mean, that was, you know, the draft is never going to happen again. So it's just, you know, you need to have this psychological thing going on with the public to have recruit a, you know, service members.
Have you seen Rossellini's Germany Year Zero?
So question is, Rossellini's Germany Year Zero.
I feel
Yes.
like that's a very good anti-war movie, and more so from the civilian point of view because it shows.
Oh yeah, that's a
what
beautiful
the
movie.
civilian has to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Production designed by the Allied forces.
Yeah, exactly.
it's Germany just destroyed and a kid walking around in it. It's so sad.
The
Too.
ending. Oh,
Oh, that's the
I wasn't
saddest
prepared
ending in
for it.
film history. Germany Year Zero. Great one of those great war movies. Just World War II had just ended, and Rossellini takes to the streets and kind of fashions a movie amongst the ruins. It's beautiful.
Speaking of incredibly depressing movies, Germany Year Zero will do it for you.
There's a lot of
yeah.
depressing war movies, but damn it, they're
This one was really sad. I cried the whole time.
yeah, this is sad. I mean, what again? There's nothing heroic, nothing sad. It's you know,
Well, you see it on the
constant-
streets everywhere, and it doesn't matter where you are in the States.
Mhm.
You see veterans everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So the ubiquitous
Yeah.
veterans in the streets and really seeing, I mean, this was representing the time when they were first on the
The big
streets.
difference between then and now is I think our country, we don't treat returning vets that way. You know, like that was true apparently. You know, I don't remember it. I was kind of young, but that the anger toward the war spilled over to the anger toward the returning vets. Like, hey, you killed kids, you did. It was you know, they're just a bunch of people got drafted, and I don't think our culture's ever going to probably do that again. But, you know, there's something to actually, this sounds horrible, but I think in the big meta thinking about this, there's probably something to be said for that. Because right now we're so busy kissing ass for everybody who was ever there. Oh, thank you for your service. There's a new film out called Thank You for Your Service. And it's like, those guys kind of get tired of hearing that. You know, we have such a divided population, you know, like less than 1% of our culture now is in the military. There's a huge disconnect between the general population. Where here, it was really across the board. Well, the rich kids always got out of war, you know, but it was still pretty, you know, dispersed amongst the population. Now it's kind of this, there's like a warrior class. And I think people feel guilty, but I think that makes the government take them all the more for granted. You know, like, hey, they signed up. We heard our president say, well, you knew what he signed up for. You know, fuck you.
Yeah. One thing that this film does really well about representing that generation is the sort of everything turned upside down. And you hear that in a lot of what Tom Cruise's character, what Ryan Kovic is saying, and the way that people are acting, and also just the idealization of this small town in the beginning and then turning into this darker, strange world. Everything's so confusing. And I think that was something that affected that generation is, and perhaps audience members who can speak to that would be interesting to hear your thoughts, but the movie, I think, is turning the world upside down. That what they were told of the world was not.
It's a great depiction of changing times. You see the 60s kind of slowly catch up with him. You know, it took him a while. He was like a half generation behind just because of his own experience. But even there in the VA hospital where the guy's like, hey man, you're either with us or, you know, the brothers are getting it together. You know, he's kind of getting hip to the vibe. It takes him a while, but yeah, it's a great depiction of changing culture, changing times, and just the way, I think that had never happened, obviously, before. That a culture, you know, they were for that war for, I don't know how much they were for it, they just weren't against it, you know. And we just took it all for granted, and then it was like, no, this is maybe not the best thing to be doing. It took about 10 years or something. I don't know if any of you have been watching, or it played a while back, but I think you can still get it. Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, Vietnam on PBS. It's about 18 hours, but it's really, really great. There's just a lot of great archival work there, a lot of interviews with the North and South Vietnamese. I'd really suggest that everyone should watch it. Really, just this and that would maybe keep us out of the next war.
Got a question about the actors. Isn't Willem Dafoe older than Tom Cruise, or is he?
In real life, yes, Willem Dafoe's
That's right. So I think
older.
him being on the set, I think that might have had an impact on Tom Cruise's performance, that he had to raise it up a notch or two because Dafoe is so.
Defoe is so.
Some comment about Willem
You know what was
Dafoe's
funny about
performance.
the last time all of us had seen Defoe on screen was playing Jesus in Last Temptation. To see his foul mouth, you know, fucking whoremongering, you know, all that is just like, oh, it's Jesus
But
at a
then
whorehouse.
in the desert, you know,
Yeah, it
having
was like-
the Jesus devil conversation.
Because he's in the same, he looks and he's just, that little Defoe moment in his whole life was Jesus and this guy. It was just kind of funny.
Chill, Jesus.
Defoe is great. Now, I thought it's a nice touch to have Berenger, you know, the two guys from Platoon, the good and bad, you know. One's recruiting and then one's there for him. Yeah.
Any thoughts about the film? Anything you all want to talk about?
Just a
Yes,
discussion.
right here.
I'm sitting up here
Well, I thought
rambling
the
on.
music was very evocative too. I mean, it was so patriotic. I mean, it did make you feel, you know, that fervor that he had for the country to serve and everything. So I thought that was very effective.
Yeah, the music is great. The score and also the use of all those patriotic songs and
Yeah, and the songs of the time too. You know, I mean, it's a little obvious. He's listening to that one room and his brother's trying to play. These times are changing. You know, again, but it's, you know, it works. My one complaint though was it's 68 and he has American Pie. Everyone knows American Pie didn't come out till like 70. But I don't know. Those guys were there. I don't know what their excuse is for that. It's a great song, but it wasn't out in 68. Or 68.
yes.
So why do you think Oliver Stone fed us something like the scene with the mom right before he gave the speech, but then didn't show us the speech? I thought that was an interesting choice.
Yeah.
So the choice not to show Ron Kovic's speech at the end of the film.
That reminded me of a film about FDR, he had been governor of New York, with the whole like second half or even more was focused on him being able to stand up at the podium at the Democratic convention, and he couldn't. His legs totally didn't work at all.
Right.
But he had those big, strong wooden braces. He was able to pull himself forward, and as soon as he stood up, then you could tell he was going to be the next president. And they didn't show the whole
The
speech.
film
they just
ends
pulled
Right.
back.
It's
there, like you could get there.
yes.
In my opinion, he gives the speech to the reporter kind of impromptu. Everything he said there, he probably said in the speech, or to some degree, don't you think?
And he signed the book, so he obviously has already told us.
By 80, you know, when he's at the convention, yeah, he's already a celebrity. You know, Ron Kovic was a That book was a bestseller. He was kind of wined and dined. Hollywood had bought his story. He was hanging out at Studio 54. He said a story, something you heard, he was at the Playboy Mansion or something.
Yeah.
So he was, you know, he was kind of the guy.
Is he still alive?
Still alive,
Yeah.
yeah. And speaking out about recent wars and all their forms. If you're ready, I think Iran is next.
It reminded me of Coming Home too. That's the other kind of anti-war, anti-Vietnam War.
Well, you know, Coming Home's based on him too. Jane Fonda met him and kind of fashioned a story about a paralyzed vet. It's not his story, but that notion came from Ron Kodak. So he had a big influence in the post-war, anti-war, movement and stuff.
And Coming Home came out in '78, and we're doing a screening in January. We're doing 1978 series, so come to that. It'll be on 35 millimeter.
Yeah, I had forgotten about the scene where he goes to Georgia to talk to the family, and I immediately thought of the Cicely Tyson scene in Last Flag Flying.
Uh-huh.
You got two different choices,
Yeah.
equally honorable. Here we
So
go.
the scene where he meets the family in Georgia, there's a scene in Last Flag Flying, Rick's latest film.
I hadn't
about,
seen this since we did the movie, but I remember talking to Daryl, my co-writer on that, who wrote the book it was based on, kind of. And yeah, we discussed that, because that scene's actually not in the book. We had worked it up, and I talked about it. Well, isn't that? And it's funny how you misremember. I remember the mom telling him what Lily Taylor, the widow, a young Lily Taylor. Isn't it great, all the young cameos in this? We got so many great, Kira Sedgwick, Frank Whaley. There's just a lot of great, it's a great cast throughout this. But I swear I remember the mom being pissed at him, and she was so like, we feel your pain. I don't remember that at all. But it was, I was talking about like war films talk to each other. I think that was, in Last Flag, we were thinking, yeah, best to let the, truth is a blunt, instrument, maybe. I don't know if you're doing them a favor or not. It's really more about you than them, so.
Speaking of making a war movie, they had a ton of consultants on this, and you worked with military consultants.
Yeah.
And what's that like?
It's,
and how do they
it
approach
really
you?
shaped I work with a bunch of, Marines, and they kind of say the same thing. They're like, yeah, they really train you. Because I said, well, what are you doing? This one guy, he's kind of acting. So what did you do when you get out? And he goes, yeah, you show back up in society. It's like, hey, I can operate a gun. I can kill people. I don't know. You're just plopped back with nothing. There's just nothing. Not a class. Nothing. It's just the big tragedy of this, and it's going on every day. 20 vets of our recent wars, 20 killed themselves. That's an unbelievably tragic, horrible number. And it's for this reason that obviously the government will use you, and then when you're done, you're kind of on your own. So I don't, it's just the isolation they feel, that at least you need that same camaraderie. There's suddenly you're back and no one understands, So I see a lot of guys struggling because, it's just so unnatural, to kill or, to see killing.
You turned into a war
to
machine,
kill.
and
I
then
think my theory is like, there's 1% of the population is cut out to be, psychopaths who might like killing, The American Sniper dude.
hopefully less than one.
Yeah, but other than that, just says that most people aren't. Yeah. It's really unnatural. It's horrible. Anyway, I'm so anti-war, so I had to bite my tongue the whole time. I was dealing with these guys, and you can't help but be pulled in. It's like, yeah, you kind of respect their bravery and than they went in with. It's important to get them young.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, for our freedom, we all kind of repeat the same things. Oh, for our freedom, and it's like, really? When was the last time we fought for our freedom? When was our freedom under attack? Been a while.
Anti-war movie. I am anti-war, so I watch it and I'm like, yes, I agree. War is bad.
Well, who's pro-war here? Let's have a discussion. I'm sorry.
Well, some people are willing to say that
I'm
yes,
ready to have that
the US
debate.
should go to war for this or that reason. Do you think this movie has what it takes to take that person through Tom Cruise's journey in this film and end up on the other side?
What's the first part of that? What does the movie to do?
Well, does this movie take a person on a journey with Tom Cruise to say, if you're interested in war, you know, and then to come out on the other side, like to be like Hrunkovic is in the beginning and come out.
I hope so. I mean, I think you're doing young people a favor to make them watch stuff like this and the Vietnam documentary. I had friends who were ready to fight in, the, 10 years ago in the early, the Iraq invasion. I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? You're gonna go fight for Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney? Are you kidding? But they were just kind of gung-ho young men. I was just really, I remember showing a guy, Michael Moore's documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11. At least watch that. At least see the corruption around it. War is a big money making. It's a big capitalist undertaking. So intertwined with our culture, though. I don't know what the answer is, but it's crazy our priorities.
Patriotism is an idea, but it's something that people identify with. So it's
War?
Patriotism.
Well, there's something in men that's just kind of flawed. You see it in the little kids at the beginning. They're shooting and throwing rocks at each other. It's just something in the male psyche is forever screwed up.
We had another question back here, so I'm gonna, yes, great.
Yeah, so I guess I was wondering about the end of the film, especially when he tells the reporter that he feels like maybe he's coming home, right? And then the screen fades to white. I was just wondering, given the fact that this occurs after Reagan and now HW is president, but I guess the movie feels like maybe it turns and becomes less a social critique and more about Ronkovic's personal journey.
So you're talking about the
So-
ending of the film
Yeah,
being,
the film and also the scene
Mhm.
where he's coming clean to the family and like you say that's I guess more for himself than necessarily
Yeah.
for them.
That didn't
Right.
really happen in real life, by the way.
Gotcha.
That's one of the few things in the movie that he had that guilt and it wore him, but he never did. I think, again, Oliver Stone kind of thought that would round that up.
Right. So I guess what you were saying about him gradually becoming hip to the movement
Yeah.
of the 60s, anti-war, but this film being situated at the tail end of the 80s, I don't know, ending on an optimistic note like that.
But the year at the end, is it
76.
76?
Right.
He's speaking at the convention. And I think that's taken him, what? He's been back 8 years. I think it's true, though. He feels like it's his country again, that he feels at home here. I think he was so just disoriented and so
And the war was over.
out of place. And the
Yes, the
war
war
didn't
was-
end until 75, technically. There wasn't a draft from about 72 or 73 on. So it was winding down, but it wasn't over till, what, April 75? So,
this one was next.
It's interesting to see how he handled the World War II veterans in the film. Looked at them very negatively. And I get it, it's a different kind of war, but you can look at documentaries like Let There Be Light that show like veterans of World War II have PTSD that they didn't
Boy.
see. But
that's a tough one. Before they had the word PTSD,
Right.
that is John Huston's film, Let There Be Light.
it's just interesting to see how he portrays these people looking negatively at these veterans when like, yes, it's the Great War.
Was it
Right,
anyone
yeah.
beyond the one time in the bar where he is being kind of obnoxious?
Yeah.
But
I guess I
There are
was
the-
parade.
Yeah, the parade, there's World War II veterans in the parade, and then the ones introducing him, you assume that those are World War II veterans. And you're interested in the portrayal. I didn't read them always as negative, just as, but the inclusion of them as the precedent of,
And they were brave, and it was
Yeah.
great.
right, they're
Well,
so
the
brave.
contrast between the two parades couldn't be greater. The one when he was a little kid, it's just all heroicism. The other one, there's protesters there. They're not buying in. And that's the time he's the returning vet, so he doesn't get that. I mean, like I said, this is the first generation that didn't get Johnny Comes Marching Home. They didn't get that largely.
And that first sequence with that first parade was just beautifully shot.
Yeah.
colors that I'm using.
I always remember the one guy, he does that slower motion shot, the guy who's missing both arms. That face is really stunning, and he just turns and looks. He must have been looking. No, he's not looking right at the camera, but he's looking close to. It's like a. Wow, that shot is so. There's so many shots like that in the movie that are just.
Does anyone remember this being shot in Dallas? You do.
Some of it was in Dallas,
I
yeah.
actually worked in a restaurant in downtown. I worked for an attorney during the day and see people at Sam's Cafe. And so Mr. Stone and some of the crew would come in and eat there.
What?
And I don't think that I really realized at that age what was going on. But watching it again, I do have to say I saw it when it came out in real time. And seeing it tonight, it just feels like it was shot last week. I mean, it doesn't,
I know.
it just hasn't, and seeing all the jewels in the
Tom Cruise looks the
wasteland,
same.
there's always that dated element. But it just seems so, it just seems so current, and so
Yeah.
everything just seems.
Yeah, it's really.
As you say,
It's aged well, as in not at all. Fundamentally. Yeah, it was in. What scenes did they do in Dallas? Like all of? I mean, were the protests and was the little small town? Was that right outside it or
I think
section
it
of that?
was, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, again, I was, in my 20s.
Yeah.
And I just remember them all coming into the restaurant. I remember Mr. Stone walking in one night and asking me for a cocktail. And I was like, I don't know, a cocktail.
And then he was back there a couple years later doing JFK.
Did anyone catch the cameo of the Hollywood director who was a 10-year-old extra in this film?
That's right. Here's a
Yeah, this
trivia
is the-
question. Or
yeah,
was he 12?
I'll think of
I think
some-
he was 12.
12 years old? Okay.
What's he? But he's an
Raise your
for a long
hand
time
if you got that.
Austin-based. He's all of our friend. Come on.
Well, that
You told us.
you're a cheater.
It's in the baseball game during the credits when he hits the home run.
Yeah.
And it cuts to the girl, and it's like the worst extra performance you've ever seen as a girl.
You get to say his name or
His
should we?
eyes, it is David Gordon Green.
But he credits
David
that with.
actually said it's the movie, he got $30, and it's the movie that made him want to be a director. And actually watching this, I don't know if everyone saw Stronger, but the VA stuff, like actually, I was feeling a really visceral connection between that. And Stronger is actually an excellent movie. It didn't really land, yeah, I was thinking, and even the George Washington with the like parade at the beginning, I was definitely seeing all these David things that may have crept in.
You can tell it's him because he stares at the camera like this. And he's wearing a red shirt.
We love those kind of extras.
It's amazing. You had a comment over here.
Well, like you were saying with war movies talking to each other, have you seen The Best Years of Our Lives that came out in 1946?
Certainly, yeah.
To me, that's an anti-war movie. It's been
Yeah,
over a decade.
it's in the genre of coming home movies. It's one of the classics, I had a screening of Last Flag in the Bay Area, and a woman came up to me after and says, this is like my dad was Dana Andrews, best years. He says this is in, and we just talked a lot about that. And we went to the same college, Sam Houston. Dana Andrews was from Texas, whatever. We bonded over our home movies.
We have a couple more comments, and then we'll talk about next week. But yes, there's one over there. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say I was taken to see this movie when I was 9 years old, and it scarred me for life, and it was traumatizing.
It kept you from enlisting, though, right?
Yes, I was going to say, the older I get, the more I realize I think this movie played a big part in me eventually becoming the 37-year-old peace-loving Democrat therapist that I am now.
Thank you, Oliver Stone.
Yeah. Well,
All right.
There needs to be more messages like this. I mean, you risk being unpatriotic. That's what is heroic at the end. They're at the Republican convention, these vets who put their asses on the line for their country, who were wounded in action, and, these people calling them communists, come on. But it's always like that, It's in the run-up to the next war, if you speak out, you're unpatriotic.
Although there is a difference between Hitler and Ho Chi Minh, I mean,
Well,
quantitatively.
to get the clear war, you have to go back 70 plus years to get the last time where it was like,
Right.
Yeah,
if
it's
you
a
actually
tough
think of our
question.
country's history and you look back, how many, you know, people are still figuring out
Yeah.
what World War I was for.
Didn't need to happen.
You know, I think World War II is kind of the last one.
Don't forget about the fire bombings of Europe and Japan. I mean, like it was a just war, but there was still
It was horrific, you
still
know.
war.
I mean, everyone always has to remember it's dead civilians.
War is war.
Yeah, it's firebomb, it's dead civilians, all wars now.
There's a comment over here.
I was just curious about it being an anti-war film, and more so than Coming Home or The Best Years of Our Lives, I felt really strange watching it this time that there's something so pro-USA about it, and it really rubs your face in it. As you said, Stone's not that subtle.
About this is,
I think it's really meant to affect us, but I think that's a weird kind of contradiction within the film, that it's so anti-war and yet it's so pro-USA, which is kind of a
well,
Felt like the film was patriotic.
I think
Interesting.
Stone is one of these liberal patriots, you know, he's not gonna let that word, you know, in Salvador, there's a great scene where James Woods is like, hey, you guys don't get it. I love my country. You know, he's like, you know, he's talking about how much he loves the US, but he's kind of a radical, you know, so I think that side always gets polite and quiet, where the louder side is the, you know, the more love it or leave it kind of.
Abby Hoffman would frequently say how much he loved the country and how much of a patriot he was.
And it's kind of Abby takes his final bow in this movie. I guess he had passed away before the movie came out, so it's kind of sad seeing him in there.
I heard
But
somebody say I may
he's
not.
giving it hell his last shot. He's going, ah.
Yeah.
It's weird, 50-whatever-year-old Abby Hoffman is there, but I guess it works. Yeah.
But, so that was Abby Hoffman?
That is Abby Hoffman.
That was Abby Hoffman playing that.
Abby Hoffman's playing Abby Hoffman. The leader of the protest. We're going to go to Washington. He seems to be having fun. He has a big smile on his face. He's like, yes, this is the good old days. You know, he's happy. Happy to be up there. You can just tell.
Okay, we'll take one more and then we're gonna wrap up. Yes, in the back.
I'm 10 years younger than Ron Kovic, and I grew up on Long Island. And in ninth grade was 1970, and we had at the junior high school an anti-war demonstration. And at that moment, I decided I was never going to go to any war. And I had seen the movie when it came out, and I found it very depressing. But now I don't find it depressing. But when I saw it, I knew it was a great movie.
Yeah.
But even though it was way after the war, it just didn't feel the subject matter was a happy one.
Yeah, it's not a. I guess it should be depressing, you know. War should be. Yeah, I really resent heroic war movies, or you know, any notion of that. I think it's just so dangerous. So, or what about funny war movies? You know, that's my is MASH an anti? You know, that's
No,
what
I
because
was
I
gonna
think
bring
black
up
comedy
MASH,
is.
yeah.
You know, Dr. Strangelove is not really a war movie, but it is obviously a Cold War movie.
MASH is. I was thinking when you made that comment
Make
about.
them ridiculous or like anti-war because of the ugly reality. Like, how do you get around the subject to say, hey, this really is ridiculous and is really sucks for everyone you know, involved. Catch-22.
Catch-22.
I mean, there's a lot of these that they're trying to do show the absurdity.
Well, laughter is a medicine for people. I mean, and yes, sometimes the truth is very depressing. It's hard to look at. It's hard to cope with. That's what we were watching a lot of. But I feel like hope is something. Hope, optimism. These are things that can help bring us out of that. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about his character. And maybe a contrast to Willem Dafoe's. Willem Dafoe's is kind of caught in this loop where he can't get out.
Yeah.
But Kovic finds a way to find his purpose again. Because
Mhm.
he lost his purpose because his purpose was built on lies.
Exactly.
Yeah. And on that note, I'm going to give you my mom's review of the movie because she's friends with Ron Kovic. They met in Chicago in the 70s, and she likes the film, but she said that it doesn't really express Ron's personality because to me he is pure joy.
Right. That's what, the little I've seen him, he has a big smile on his face. I think he's, yeah, whereas I think Stone's more serious and very dramatic and probably did pull that, you know.
Yeah.
It's hard to do a exact, yeah, he doesn't have that.
But I think it's where he
Joy.
was in this period too.
Yeah,
but
you caught him a little.
yeah, I think he
After
was,
all.
according to Mom, he's incredibly charismatic and
Mhm.
fun, and like was just fun
Yeah,
and joy.
He has kind of a rock star element to him. But that's a guy who's been through obviously so much and survived, so he's earned that kind of, hey, just happy to be alive.
Yeah.
You know, when he wrote this book in a very short amount of time, apparently he wrote it in like a month, you know, just straight through, no paragraphs, you know, no, just he poured out it because he thought he wasn't going to live very long. It was not that far behind him here, all this, and he just wanted to share his experiences just so people knew what it really felt like to go through that. So bless him for that impulse, you know. So I think that's the most effective activists are, you know, they have a voice that you can't just dismiss entirely, especially about politicians who didn't serve. Have you noticed we haven't had a president in a long time who served? You know, Donnie Deferment currently is, yeah. So.
Yeah, that convention seems a little too real with what we saw on TV.
But you know, people who've really served, who come back and are speaking truth about what it's like and making reasonable arguments why it's not a good idea. That's pretty powerful, you know. So you really need that. And I met a bunch, you know, in the film I was doing. Definitely, they tend to not like the civilian command too much and have a lot of problems with it, you know. But to me, one of the war movie of our time, if anyone could ever have the clout or the guts to make it, would be like the Pat Tillman story. Similar to this, killed by friendly fire, the government lies about it, makes him a hero. But he had his own, you know, everybody remember Pat Tillman? He was a football player, signed up for the war, he and his brother, and became enlightened. You know, once he was over there, he starts reading Noam Chomsky. You know, he educates himself. That's why they prey on young people, because it's like, oh, you start gaining the knowledge and the worldly wisdom, and it's too late. You're over there, you know, and you know the government's got you, but they're maturing too. It's right at the age where you're kind of becoming enlightened, especially if you're from, you know, maybe a military family or a part of the country or a small town where it's just not in your face too much. So you're having your own journey, which I think is really fascinating. So Tillman had that. You know, he was over there, still in uniform, still fighting, but going, you know, this war is illegal.
And the doc is great, a great way to see that story too, the Pat Tillman story,
Yeah.
right? Amir Barlev is a documentary you can watch, but a narrative would be great.
That's a great war story too, and you know, so disgusting at the end of that. Donald Rumsfeld, who claims not to remember where he was when he heard Pat Tillman die. You know, Rumsfeld was they caught him. He had a signature machine doing the letters to the Gold Star families. Like he didn't have time to just sign the letters to the dead people. He had a machine doing it. Those are the guys sending you off to war. So always remember that. Anyway.
Speaking, okay, well this
So
is
you young
a
people here,
terrible
don't sign up for the next one.
terrible transition, but let's talk about next week.
Next week.
Which
Not
is
a war
film,
movie.
not a war movie, but it is called The Dead.
It is a great last movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's John Huston, who made a fair bit, Let There Be Light, and some good war movies.
Yes.
Another sad, yeah, based on a James Joyce story. There's this one. Hadn't seen it in a while. I remember it being very beautiful, and that's just kind of a tribute to, you know, this is kind of a director at the early part of what would be his film career, you know, in the early wave. John Huston, it's his last film. He's hooked up to I have a picture on my wall of Johnny Huston hooked up to an oxygen thing, making The Dead. I was like, that's really inspiring. Dude, he's like 87 in a wheelchair, hooked up to oxygen, making a movie. I'm like, wow, okay. And this is the movie starring his daughter, and the adaptation is by his son, Tony Huston, a writer. So it's kind of a family affair, and it's a small little, Dublin story, but it's about a guy who, as I remember, just realizes his life isn't what when you're not who you think you are. It's a big subject,
If we did a series of last films, what else would you put in there?
Is that?
Oh.
You say
Oh, Kurosawa.
Kurosawa's,
His last film was.
It wasn't Dreams, was it? Was
Yeah.
Dreams the last one?
Dreams?
Really?
Was it Dreams?
Which one?
Sorry, the last Kurosawa film is Matadeo.
Matadeo. Okay.
Came out 3 years
After Dreams, that's what
Right,
yeah.
Okay.
He had a good final. He's kind of like John Huston and Kurosawa were these guys who were blessed to have these long lives and were making really relevant work that are in their 80s. So that's inspiring. A lot of other filmmakers who died younger, still make good last films. Fassbinder had a couple good last films.
Yeah.
He made so many films. I count like 2 or 3 of them were his last
Truffaut
film.
had great last
Yeah,
films. Yeah.
and
Kubrick.
Pasolini had Sallow feels like a last film. I don't know if it's a tough film, but it's Pasolini's last film. But yeah, I don't know if Eyes Wide Shut is a good last film. I could have used another Kubrick film. I like that movie, but it doesn't feel like a last film. I don't give it that. But
Sarah Band.
Yeah.
That's
does
good.
that go down as the last one?
It depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
But, you consider it.
Yeah, another had a good long.
Well,
So anyway,
We'll get
next week
into
it's a
one,
beautiful
and we'll talk
film.
about
Just
last
it's
films.
very contemplative and beautiful and thoughtful. That's I don't know. I don't know any other way to pitch it.
and then our
you know?
final film is Wings of Desire, which is the following week, and that's it for this time
Yeah,
of the
a couple more
series.
Jewels in the Wasteland.
Yeah.
Working our way through the 80s. But like I said, this is the last, chronologically, this was the end of the 80s. But, we're in the last 87, 89. So
Yeah, and those
the
are
end.
pretty popular. So if you haven't got your ticket for Wings,
Yeah.
I encourage you to
that'd
do
be
it
fun
because
to
it
see that
may
on
sell
the big
out.
screen. Very,
Yeah.
very poetic.
Well,
And
thanks
there's
for
no-
coming
thanks for-
and
this was
watching
fun.
Born on the
Thanks
4th of
you
July.
guys for checking out. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Rick.